Well, good morning, Lakeside, and welcome to church, and welcome to my backyard. This is Andrea's and my cottage in the city, and it's kind of a fun place to be, and we're taping outside today. So welcome to our message. And last week we left you on a bit of a cliffhanger. I don't know if you remember, but Mark Gagnon, our teaching pastor, brought out one of these, and wow, I was laughing. That brought back some memories. My mom chasing me around with one of these, or chasing one of my sisters around, and some of you might have remembered that too. So it brought back some memories. And Paul talked about, I might come to you with a whip, and Mark gave us a few ideas of what that might have meant. Well, today, I think we're going to find out a little bit more. And just a heads up as we get started this morning, we're going to be talking about a situation in the early church, in the church in Corinth, that had to do with sexual sin. And I'm not going to be speaking about that any more graphically than the Bible itself talks about. But if you think that's a conversation that your kids, the kids that are gathered around with you today, might not be ready for, I totally get that. Just remember that you can pause the live stream for a few minutes if you need to, and you can return to it later, or you can find the whole broadcast later on Facebook or from our website. Wow. So if that didn't wake you up, maybe you just need to duck over that way and get yourself another cup of coffee to get going this morning. Sometimes I say to friends of mine that someday I'm going to write a book about stories about the church. But, you know, Lakeside, if I did, you probably wouldn't believe half the stuff that I would write down in there. So I'll probably forego the book for now. But sometimes the things that happen in the church are downright scandalous, aren't they? A friend of mine speaking about his church, not Lakeside, another church, said, yeah, we've had a few uprisings over the years, and yeah, uprisings seem to be part of the territory at the church every now and again, but then there are uprisings, and then there are scandals, and you might know a story that goes kind of like this. The pastor of the church has an affair with someone in the congregation, or maybe someone on the staff of the church, or if not an affair, maybe substitute another type of scandal. Maybe there was money that was stolen from the church's income. Maybe there was a pattern of abuse or addiction that was known by a few people in private, but not known in public until it was known in public. The pastor announces he's going to be separating from his wife, or in some cases, the pastor just refuses to resign. Everybody has an opinion about that. The elders get busy with meetings, trying to figure out what the messaging is for the public around this. Everyone says, I didn't see it coming. Apparent gaps in accountability are identified and addressed. Life goes on, and everybody's left a little bit in shock. Sometimes it's not the pastor, but it's a person in the church, and quiet conversations develop. Some people call it gossip, but that's a whole message for another day. Did you hear what happened to Adam? Yeah, I can't believe it. Didn't know that about him. Conversations go on like that. A few friends of Adam give him a call and say, what gives, man? What's going on? I had no idea. The elders and church staff try and figure out what to do with what they know. If the person's in a leadership role of any kind at the church, a conversation develops about maybe this person needs a step back from their leadership role. Everyone has an opinion about how things are handled. Some people say that it was just about right. Some people say, no, should have been even more harsh what was done. Some people said, oh, that was way too harsh. It was hypocritical, and life goes on. Sometimes nothing at all happens, and all of these are possible in the church. And you probably know a story or two like that from your own experience, and we're never too sure just what the right response should have been. And when things like this happen in a church, a lot of damage happens, seen and unseen. And some of you know what I'm talking about. You've experienced it firsthand. You've known someone who was in a situation like this, and as a result, they had a crisis of faith. They left the church, or even left their faith entirely. Somehow they just became collateral damage. And you thought to yourself, this isn't right. Now, others of you know a situation like this, but there was no crisis of faith in this instance. The person seems to respond with, I don't know what everybody's so up in arms about. What's the big deal? And people who know the person say, I thought she was a Christian. Oh, doubt and confusion rise. Other people shrug it off and say, oh, it happens all the time. And for some of you or people you know, that's why at best, God and the church are kept at arm's length. Faith seems to erode. People cease being open to God, or at worst, someone you know hits the unfollow button permanently. And today we're going to look at one of those situations, a story from the early church, from the city of Corinth. And so whether you've seen it up close or even from a distance, whether you've ever wondered what the right thing to do is, whether you're new to Jesus following or whether you've been a Jesus follower for a long time, today we're going to dive into what I'm going to call the Jesus way of dealing with the crazy factor. And today's story from a church definitely fits the definition of scandalous. So let's start off with what Paul says. It is actually reported. I love that as a lead into this. It is actually reported. Word had traveled to Paul, and that wasn't easy. In fact, word was still traveling. Paul was 389 kilometers away, straight across the Aegean Sea, over in the city of Ephesus, writing this letter. 1,400 kilometers if by land, and word had reached him, and Paul was not impressed. Are you ready for it? It is actually reported that there is sexual immorality among you, and of a kind that does not occur even among pagans. A man has his father's wife. I love the way Eugene Peterson, the writer of the Message version of the Bible, puts that. He says, I also received a report of scandalous sex within your church family. I probably shouldn't say that too loud around my neighborhood here. But anyway, received a report of scandalous sex within your church family, a kind that wouldn't be tolerated even outside the church. One of your men is sleeping with his stepmother. Incest is our modern word for it. The man is having an ongoing sexual relationship with his stepmother. Ew. Take a moment, pause, and let that sink in. Or wait. No, don't let that sink in. I don't think you really want to. Paul goes on to say, and you are proud. I love again how Eugene Peterson puts this. He says, you're above it all, so above it all that it doesn't even faze you. Maybe you've seen something like that in your experience. The Corinthian church had issues, there's no doubt, and already in these first 4 chapters of the book, we've been introduced to some of those things, and you can find those if you want to catch up on earlier messages through our journey through 1 Corinthians. And we know that the Corinthian church had issues, but what was going on here seemed to take things to a whole nother level. What was going on in their church wasn't even occurring outside the church. In fact, this kind of behavior was outlawed by Roman law, making it even more scandalous. And a couple of things are going on here. First, the person's actions in the church that were just beyond the pale of what Greek society of the day considered acceptable. And this person continued that practice even inside the church, and that is a problem. Secondly, we discover a church seemingly unable or unwilling to deal in any effective way with the situation, and Paul addresses both of these. But let me first point out the obvious, and it's the first point of our message that we're going to hang things on today, and it's this: the Jesus community is an imperfect community. Maybe you say, well, he's just stating the obvious. Well, it is kind of obvious, but in a way it's kind of a relief, because Jesus followers don't have it all together, or they don't live in sinless perfection. Now, maybe someday when I retire and buy an island and it's just me and my close friends and family up there, maybe that'll be sinless perfection. I kind of doubt it, because I'll be there. But anyway, Paul references that he's experiencing a war in another place. He even says the urges that I have to do right and fighting the urges that are within me not to do right. And he experiences this war going in for control in his life. And every one of us, whether you're a follower of Jesus or you're a person who just has a personal moral code that isn't based on Jesus, you've experienced what I'm talking about, this internal war to do what is right. You know what that fight is like. And the fight does not stop when you cross the line of faith and become a Jesus follower. So friends, let's stop expressing shock and awe the next time something scandalous seems to happen, whether in our church or in our neighborhood or in our company. But still, This was quite a situation. Paul calls out the behavior of the individual sleeping with his stepmother. Again, ew. His reaction is that he's filled with grief. He's already passed judgment on the person, he says, for what they're doing. And he says the correct response should be and should have been that you should have put the man out of your fellowship. And later in this passage, he's going to say it even more strongly and say, you should hand the man over to Satan. What? Hand the man over to Satan? Now that is scandalous, and that is in your Bible. Remind me of that one in a few minutes because I'm going to come back to it. Well, Paul also calls out the church for their apathy, their pride in not dealing with things that should have been dealt with. He uses the illustration of yeast in dough, and let me just read that for you. He says, your boasting is not good. Don't you know that a little yeast works through the whole batch of dough? Remember that era when we had bread makers? We got one of those. That's probably when I was first introduced to what yeast is really like, those tiny little seeds of yeast that you'd put in the dough and mix it all around, and soon enough that spread through the whole batch. That's kind of the picture that I have of yeast spreading through dough, but for these ancient Jews, they had an even deeper picture of that yeast was a symbol of sin, and with the Passover festival, as it was talked about in the Old Testament, that yeast needed to be cleaned out of the house, and Paul's listeners would have known this was an illustration for sweeping sin out of the house. But in Corinth, tolerance had moved beyond to commendation. I sort of imagine it like this over in Corinth, just using my imagination here, friends. John is sleeping with his mother-in-law. Did you hear? Oh, yeah, I heard. Well, you never know where love can bloom these days. Hey, why should we stand in the way? Or maybe somebody said, I love that we're such a non-judgmental church. I'm kind of happy for them, actually. Somebody else might have said, well, you know, none of us are perfect either. And the lesson from the early church in Corinth was that extreme toleration leads to decimation. And this was Paul's concern. Decimation. He says, guys, the whole thing is going to cave in on itself. This fledgling Jesus movement is going to crash around you if you keep going this way. He's saying there's a line, and you've not only crossed it, you can't even see it in the rearview mirror. And you know what this is like. Maybe you're a person who grew up with the message or the ethic of life that just said, hey, just live your truth, just live your way. Or maybe this one that you've heard a lot in our culture. Hey, as long as you're not harming somebody else, it's okay, it's all good. And yet you know that sometimes that doesn't turn out well. It leads to havoc in the family or the company or the neighborhood. You saw the harm. You saw somebody's future cut short, somebody's dreams extinguished by hurtful words and behavior of another person. Or maybe it was you who experienced it personally. You maybe even went to people and tried to speak up or get somebody to speak up, but no one had the courage to do anything about it. And it just led to decimation. And that's what Paul is saying. He's saying this idea of a light burning bright on a hill, this idea of the church as the hope of the world, this idea of the witness of the church as of a true and better way of living, the experience of personal transformation, all of that, it's all imploding as you guys practice what you think is tolerance, but in fact it's just vacuous, empty faith, and something needs to be done about it now. So if you resonate with that, if you've experienced anything like that, pay attention because there is a better way. By the way, let me remind you that Paul isn't speaking about behavior outside the church. He specifically goes on to talk about that. And sometimes we Jesus followers are known, we have a bit of a history of speaking up about the behavior of people outside the church. And Paul's saying, no, I'm speaking about people inside the church. And I've made up my mind. And sometimes there's a time when get out is the right response. And that's another one of those where you just kind of slap your face on the side of your head and you say, get out? Did he just say that? Did Paul just say that? Like as in actually remove someone from the church? Oh boy. If there's a time for that, when is that time? For the church at Corinth, Paul was letting them know this is last resort time, folks. This is last resort time. This wasn't, I see a minor problem over there that needs correcting. No, this was not that. This was last resort time. The Jesus model for dealing with conflict is actually a process. It's the process of approaching a person with one person approaching another person and saying, hey, can I talk to you about something? And if that doesn't work, reapproaching the person with a couple of people and saying, hey, can we talk to you about this for a little bit? And if that doesn't work, moving on to the next step of bringing the person in front of the church body itself. And if that doesn't work, as a last resort, then remove them. But in this case, the problem ran so deep, the life and health of the church was so threatened that drastic action was needed. Well, let's get back to the text. Here we find something really interesting, something that you didn't see coming. This wasn't Paul's angry rant. This wasn't Paul saying, I'm coming, and I'm coming with a whip. This was Paul's heart for deep and lasting, personal, and church-wide transformation. And we're going to find out that transformation requires crucial conversation. And you probably didn't see this coming in this passage, so let's go a little bit further. Transformation requires crucial conversation. Transformation, it's a good word. I get that. I get that word. I use it. I know it. I get it. Crucial conversation, I've heard about that. Those are good words too. I get that. But about what issues and what level of issues is this required? You might be sitting there going, wow, I wonder if they're watching my every move over there at Lakeside. I wonder if someone's coming after me next. You know, we have specialized ministries at Lakeside, ministries focused on recovery and restoration, where the value of transparent discussion about the issues in your life are talked about. I wonder if they're actually talking about blowing some of that up and having some church-wide meetings and just airing all that stuff out there. I wonder who the elders will call next. So many questions, so much nuance to this. And that's why at the end, I'm going to reference that we're going to have a roundtable discussion about this later in this coming week. So get ready as you think about your questions that you might want to send in as a follow-up to this. But while I'm on the topic of elders, love to be on the topic of elders. One of the elders' and I'm talking about the elders at Lakeside, one of their key responsibilities is the spiritual health of the church. It's right in their job description. They need to, and they do, carefully weigh out situations as they arise, and they need to determine what the right next step is. And I've personally witnessed and participated with elders in meetings in that process. And invariably, the discussion comes back to, what is our hope for this person? And you know what? The answer is always the same. That is that we want to see personal transformation. And what would be the best way to bring about personal transformation? I've seen our elders go on to have crucial conversations with people in the Lakeside community. And a crucial conversation, just to remind you, is where three things are present. It's where opinions vary, the stakes are high, and emotions run strong. And let's put a check mark beside each of those for the Apostle Paul here. Did opinions vary? Yeah, he was definitely on a different page than the Corinthian church about this situation. Were the stakes high? Paul seemed to imply that the whole church was in jeopardy because of this, and drastic action was required. The stakes were high. Were emotions running strong? Yeah, listen to some of the emotional language in this passage. Words like grief, pride, I'm exercising and passing judgment. Your boasting isn't good. You need to expel this person. Yeah, so this was a crucial conversation. There's all kinds of resources out there. Just go ahead and Google crucial conversation. You'll see the famous book about that. You'll see lots of other consultants write how you have a crucial conversation in your company or your organization, ways to focus on the other person, how to keep your emotions in check, how to deal in fact, etc. It's all good, but today, let's see what Paul's counsel was. Paul's counsel. Love this. Here's where we get back to it. He says, bring it out in the open, call the church together, and then here we go. Hand this man over to Satan. Hand this man over to Satan. What in the world does this mean? There's only one other place that this is talked about. By the way, I probably shouldn't be mentioning it's too loud in my neighborhood, but let's go ahead and talk about it anyway. There's only one other place where this was mentioned in the New Testament, where Paul writes to his protege Timothy and he says, I've already handed these two individuals over to Satan so that they can be taught not to blaspheme. What Paul's really saying here is put this person outside the community of the church where their behavior can run its course, where this person can hopefully come to their senses and then be restored back to the church. I kind of remind myself of that conversation, that story that Jesus told. It's found in Luke chapter 15. You can go and look it up. It's the story of the prodigal son, the story of that son in a family who said to his father, hey, give me my share of the inheritance. I just want to go and live on my own apart from our family. And the dad gives him his inheritance. The Bible says he squanders it in wild living. And sometime out there in his journey of being away from the family, it says he comes to his senses and he says, I'm in a terrible situation. I'm no better off than the pigs that I'm serving and looking after over here. I should probably go back to my father, ask his forgiveness, tell him I'm unworthy, and see if he'll take me back. And that's the picture Paul is painting here. Send the person outside the church, let them come to their senses, and then restore them to community. But let's look even a little bit closer. Because what I want you to see here is that Paul, being an expert in the Jewish law, would have known that this particular offense was called out in the Jewish law, in the Jewish scriptures. This particular offense of a person sleeping with his stepmother was called out, and this was a capital offense. And the law dictated that a person that was guilty of this specific offense should be put to death, and the other partner in the sexual relationship, put them both to death. The Bible actually says that. Sleeping with your stepmom was a capital offense. And yet Paul, the expert in the law, goes ahead and he says, just put them outside the church, let them deal with their issue, and then be spiritually restored. Hand this man over to Satan, the scripture says, so that the sinful nature may be destroyed and his spirit saved on the day of the Lord. So what's going on here? Paul was a relatively, just a few years, follower of Jesus, a new follower of Jesus, but he'd already learned the posture of this new faith community, a posture of grace, of restoration, and that rather than angry retribution in the church, this was a move of last resort with the hope of restoration. If you go ahead and read into the second letter Paul wrote to Corinth, which is conveniently called 2 Corinthians, Paul will go on to say that the man who caused all of this pain in the first place should be forgiven, should be loved on, should be restored. And he'll further go on to say that even his harsh words to the church, his goal was simply to jar them into doing the right thing, to turn things around, and that this, in fact, did occur in Corinth. And friends, this is the Jesus way of dealing with the crazy factor. I've been a follower of Jesus for 40 years now. I'm super ancient. And there have been a handful of times when Christian leaders have come alongside me, and they've carefully had a crucial conversation with me. They've challenged me on some stance that I was holding on to a little too tightly. Even now, our elders at Lakeside, every once in a while, they'll challenge me. They'll come to me about one of those stances I'm holding on to. I kind of remember a situation. Elders, I'm just speaking to you right now. Do you remember that conversation in 2018? Yeah, there was something I was holding on to a little too closely. You guys gently challenged me, and you more or less said, you're holding on to this a little too tightly. You need to think about this a little bit more. You need to take some counsel from us on this. I remembered that and I chafed under it. But I'll tell you this, I thanked them for it. Thank you, elders, for that. This is the Jesus way. The Jesus way isn't a place of calling out every issue and kicking out those who don't toe the line. No, very far from it. And here's where we come to our final and most important principle out of this passage, and it's this. The Jesus community is into reclamation and restoration, not obliteration and damnation. I'm going to say that again. The Jesus community is into reclamation and restoration, not obliteration and damnation. Let's just think about these words for a minute. Reclamation. You know, this land has been reclaimed. This building has been reclaimed. It's the process of claiming something back. Restoration means it's the action of returning something to us, to a former owner, place, or condition. I love that. And that's what the church is into. We're into reclaiming things. We're into restoring things, restoring them to their former place or condition. We're not into obliteration. In other words, we're not into removing utterly from recognition or memory. We're not into removing from existence, destroying utterly all trace, indication, or significance of. We're not into that. I'm not into that. And I hope you aren't either. We're not into damnation, discrediting, finding guilty, disapproving, rejecting, sentencing to a punishment, declaring guilty, condemning, dooming, or convicting. I'm not into that. And Paul wasn't either. Paul was into restoration. Yes, in an extreme way in this situation, but it was the heart of restoration. I want you to think back on a situation that sounded a lot like obliteration or damnation to you. Maybe think back on a situation where someone was called out publicly, and it didn't seem like a move of last resort. It seemed like this was done early and quickly. It seemed like exacting a little bit of Old Testament anger against the person. Can you think of a situation like that? It seemed like somehow we all became voyeurs into this person's personal tragedy. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't restorative. And it's not the Jesus way. Maybe think back on another kind of situation where someone leveraged their power and position in unfair ways, where favoritism was shown because of money or because of somebody's family name, where program mattered more than people, and no one said a word. No one said a word. And that's not pretty. That's not restorative. And that's not the Jesus way either. And I ask you, Lakeside, what difference would it make in the world around us if the scandalous message actually got out? If it was actually reported, like Paul says, it was actually reported. If it actually was reported that these people don't wound their own, they restore their own. Jesus said, you remember that famous saying when he said, they'll know that you're my disciples by the way that you love one another. What if that scandalous message actually got out there? Now, I've talked with our Celebrate Recovery leaders here at Lakeside. They've seen it all. And they've heard it all. And I've heard their heart for restoration. They will go mile after mile after mile with people, walking with them, loving on them, restoring them. Lakeside, I want you to reflect for a moment. Reflect on someone that you know that's lost their way completely, even if that's you yourself. Someone whose actions left you and possibly the church as a whole deeply wounded. Reflect on your urge to want to judge this person, to want to be done with this person and never see them or deal with them again. Just think about that for a second. And then think, what would looking through the lens of reclamation and restoration have meant in that situation? What would it have meant, or what does it mean? Maybe that's a current situation you're thinking of. And what would it mean to look through the lens of reclamation and restoration? Because that's the kind of church community that I want to be a part of. That's the kind of church community that we are going to be, Lakeside. We are going to fight and claw to be that. That's the kind of church where we aren't afraid of crucial conversation, but we courageously and appropriately step into each other's lives and urge each other, even sometimes jar each other, to take the next step in following Jesus. And just as we close today, I love how Eugene Peterson, again in the Message, channels Paul's thinking and puts it into modern language when he says this, and I'm going to leave you with this today. And now, isn't it wonderful all the ways in which this distress, he's talking about the letter he wrote, isn't it wonderful all the ways in which this distress has goaded you closer to God? You're more alive, more concerned, more sensitive, more reverent, more human, more passionate, more responsible. That is awesome. That's the kind of result that we want to see in our church and in every church. It's the scandalous message of grace. And so today, may that be your reality. And may that be the way that you find a way forward in the crazy factor that happens even in church. In Lakeside today, I've probably created a whole long list of what about questions for you. You're probably saying, oh man, I wish he would have talked about, but he didn't know this situation. And well, that might work here, but not there. And this thing that I saw, that would never work over there, or that doesn't work here. Write your questions. We're going to have a round table on it later this week, and we're going to try and address some. I don't know how many questions there'll be, but we'll try and address as many as we can. Send us a message through one of our social media channels. Watch for the link to send a message in the upcoming Monday newsletter. Or, hey, reach out to me personally. You find my email address on the Lakeside website. Just send me a message. We'll put your questions together, and we'll try and unpack some of those. And look forward to doing that then. So the scandalous message of 1 Corinthians continues. And just as we finally wrap up, I just want to say the Facebook stream continues for a few minutes yet. Feel free to interact over there, or maybe it's over there, whichever side of your screen where people are talking. Feel free to stay for a few more minutes and just interact with people. We love to see people do that. So have a great week, and bless you, Lakeside. Stay safe, stay healthy, stay well. We miss you.